2013, the economist Thomas Piketty wrote his best-selling book Capital in the 21st Century, which argued that global wealth inequality is set to increase. 7 years later, and the coronavirus pandemic has sent shockwaves through the world economy. So how much will the outbreak increase the gap between rich and poor? Thomas Piketty joins us now. His new book, Capital and Ideology, focuses on income inequality in various societies throughout history. It goes back a long way, Thomas. Very good to have you with us today. I wonder, when you look at the current crisis that we're in, do you think it will have a long-term impact on the distribution of wealth in the global economy?
Yes, I think it can, really contribute to change the dominant ideology in terms of how you deal with inequality, how you regulate the economy. What I see, throughout history in my book, and I should say, this is a long book, but this is a very readable book, and I think a useful book to read in these difficult times. And what I see in history is that the primary determinants of inequality are really ideological, political, rather than simply economic or technological. So what really matters is how we feel we should organize the economy. So, for instance, the crisis today is certainly going to reinforce the legitimacy of public infrastructure in health, in particular, public services in health. And, I think some countries could change their view and dominant view on how, should we have a universal healthcare system in the US? This could affect this debate. What do we do with the big public debt? This is going to be a big issue after the crisis. We've seen some quite impressive proposal in Europe, like the Spanish Prime Minister asked for basically a perpetual debt that you never reimburse of around 10% of GDP, which the central bank, the European Central Bank, will take on their balance sheet and would help countries like Spain, Italy, to recover from this very difficult crisis. Now, this is a kind of proposal you would not have had before the crisis. And I think, this is going to be a real debate for a long time, because as we know, our central banks, and in particular the ECB in Europe, has increased its balance sheet from, it used to be 10% of GDP before the 2008 financial crisis. Now it's more than 40% of GDP. This was to, save the financial sector and avoid a complete collapse of the banking system. And this was probably a good decision in the light of what happened in the 1930s. But today, it's going to be very difficult to explain European public opinion that we cannot do the same with 10% of GDP to save Europe from the COVID disaster. So you can see how views about what we do with a large public debt, what we can do with the central bank, are deeply affected by this crisis, and this is going to be with us for a long time.
Can I ask, Thomas? Joseph Stiglitz has talked about a dark moment for the European project, saying that the Europeans aren't showing solidarity, and a lot of people taking jabs, of course, at the Germans. The concern, I think, although I'm not German myself, I live here in Berlin, is that many people here in this country don't trust the southern economies as far as fiscal responsibility. Do you think that Italy and Spain can handle fiscal autonomy, or will they always just amass a ton of debt, have difficulty paying taxes, bringing in revenue, and spend more than the countries up here?
If you don't trust other countries, you should not have a common currency with them. At some point, if we decide to go with the European Union, and if we decide to go with the Eurozone, we also need, I think, to have a Eurozone parliament, assembly, where we can make decisions through the majority rule about the level of deficit, about the level of taxation, about having common bonds, common budget. And if you don't trust other countries to do that with you, then, this is a very sad news. But then what are you doing with a common currency? I think, it's very difficult to have a common currency and 19 different interest rates on which financial markets can speculate. I think there's a serious risk that the spread with respect to Italy and possibly Spain increases a lot in the coming weeks and months. And I think we have to make a concrete proposal today to mutualize the interest rate. Let me also make clear that the issue is really to mutualize the interest rate, not to mutualize the debt. Nobody is asking any country to repay the debt of another country. If you enter a common public debt system with 60% of GDP as public debt, you are not supposed to repay the debt of a country that has 120% of GDP in public debt. The problem is when you refinance the debt, can we have a common interest rate through a common debt instrument? And I think this is a legitimate demand, because if you have a common currency, you lose the possibility to have a devaluation of your currency when things go really bad. But if you lose this possibility, you must gain something else. And this something else must be interest rate stability and a mutualization of the interest rate. Otherwise, we are going to have a growing demand in Italy, and we are going to end up with really terrible people in power in Italy asking to exit this entire system.
So, Thomas, you think debt mutualization needs to be part of the solution here? You've talked often about wealth taxes, of course. Do you think that wealth taxes taxes on wealth should be part of the way that we repay these debts? And if so, how do you generate wealth creation? How do you encourage it?
Well, okay. First of all, in history, what you see is that wealth creation and economic prosperity comes primarily from education and from a certain level of equality, in particular in education. So prosperity does not come from more and more inequality, more and more concentration of wealth at the top. This is simply wrong. I have compared, tens of societies across time period, and it is just not true that when you increase concentration of wealth at the top, you have more growth. Concentration of wealth has increased a lot in the past 30 years, and growth rate, for instance, in the US has been divided by 2 over the past 30 years. So the idea is that the more inequality, the more growth. It just doesn't work like this. And in particular, US prosperity historically came from being an educational leader, from being in advance in terms of education. In the mid-20th century, you had 90% of a generation going to high school in the US. At the time, it was 20-30% in Europe or Japan. So this is this educational advance with relative equality in education, not complete equality, but not too much inequality, that is the true source of prosperity in the long run. Now, coming back to the wealth tax, and what do we do with a large public debt? Now, here at least, we have a lot of lessons from history. The COVID crisis in itself is very much new. We don't have really a precedent except the Spanish flu maybe in 1918, 1919. But in terms of large public debt crises, we have a lot of precedent. So we know what are the different ways to get rid of a large public debt. And I think the most successful experience was after World War II, when both Germany and Japan decided to use very large exceptional wealth tax on very large wealth and in particular very large financial portfolio. So this was much more successful than inflation because, of course, with inflation, you can also destroy large public debt. This is what France did after World War II. But then you also destroy the saving of, poor people or middle-class people. Whereas Germany and Japan, through this very progressive wealth tax, they were able to protect the wealth of middle class and poor people, and to ask much more to very high levels of wealth. It was up to 50% in Germany in the exceptional wealth tax that was imposed between 1948 and 1952. It was up to 90% in Japan. And if you look retrospectively at this experience, I'm not saying it's easy politically, but if you look at it retrospectively, it was a big success in the sense that it allowed these two countries to get rid of their public debt, which at the time was over 200% of national income. It was reduced very fast through this mechanism and through some other mechanisms. So, there was also the foreign debt of Germany was cancelled in 1953, or more exactly, it was postponed until a possible German unification. And then in 1991, at the time of German unification, people said, oh, well, now it's too late, and we forgot to index the debt on inflation and growth, so now these numbers are ridiculous, so let's just get rid of them. And, that's another way to do it. This can happen also through the central bank, taking more and more debt on a very long-term basis on its balance sheet.
By the way, I want to point out that I'm still paying a solidarity tax from that from the wall coming down in 1990. So 30 years later, I'm still paying a special tax to help the reunification of East and West Germany. Thomas, you can see how long these things stay around. Let me just ask you one question that I want to get in here, very important, because the German Kurzarbeit program or programs like that are helping to pay the wages of people who would otherwise be out of work are kind of the envy of the Western world. And I wonder if you think that these European social safety nets, can they hold? I mean, can they support labor during this crisis?
Yes, I think they can support labor during this crisis, and to some extent they do. But we should also remember that some countries don't have this system, and I'm very concerned, in particular in the poorer countries. Certainly in the US you don't have similar system, but if you look at the southern hemisphere and countries like India or in Africa who have started to have a lockdown as well. But if you don't have any safety net, that's not going to work. So I think this will be an opportunity to move very quickly in the direction of building at least a very basic minimum income and safety net. There were some proposals like this actually last year in India during the electoral campaign, and the Congress party in particular was proposing to set up a minimum income scheme in India, and many people say that it's time to do that, and that there is now the administrative capability to develop something like this in a country like India. And this kind of crisis could be the opportunity to do that, even though this is not the taste of the current prime minister in India, who prefers to use sort of identity politics and sometimes a lot of violence to address problems. But sometimes what I learned from history is that you find governments who didn't plan to do reforms before certain crises, and then because the context has changed completely, they end up doing things which they did not plan to do before. So let's see. Regarding European unemployment benefit system, let me also mention that there are big part of the labor force which are not well covered by this system. So you have lots of temporary workers and very flexible labor contract scheme, or self-entrepreneur or self-employed scheme with a limited social security contribution, but also limited social protection that have developed in the past 10 years, which we see today, can raise to big difficulties in times of crisis.